Services here at the Robert Crown Law Library at Stanford University School of Law. Today is September 1st, 1998, and it was 16 years ago, almost to the day, that I received the best phone call in my life. I remember it as if it was yesterday. Hello, this is Mr. Jacobstein. It looks like your name has surfaced to the top. And so began my long association with J. Myron Jacobstein, my employer, my mentor, my boss, and my hero. People watching this tape don't need much of an introduction to Mr. Jacobstein. He was truly a visionary and a leader in our field. President of the American Association of Law Libraries, the first professional law librarian here at Stanford, prolific writer, excellent lecturer, and a very caring, warm person. Fewer of you will know about Mr. Jacobstein's storytelling abilities. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to attend many lunches, dinners, and other gatherings where Mr. Jacobstein kept us in stitches with tales of the profession. Today, Erica Wayne, reference Internet Services Librarian, and I are pleased to present you with J. Myron Jacobstein in his own words. Mr. Jacobstein, perhaps you could start by telling us why you decided to become a law librarian.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul. I guess we'll have to go back a long time to 1942 when I was a senior at Wayne State University in Detroit. And along about that time, Pearl Harbor came along. And I left to enlist in the U.S. Army Air Corps and spent the next 4 years doing that. When I got discharged in 1946, I went back to Wayne, and they had a program to accelerate returning veterans, and in one semester I got my BA in history. Then I was faced with what to do with the rest of my life. I didn't feel like going ahead and becoming a historian. And one day I was talking to a girlfriend of a friend of mine who said, you know, you ought to go to library school. It's a good field for men. Well, that kind of struck me as interesting because I had never ever thought of being a librarian before that. So a few weeks later, I went up to Ann Arbor, University of Michigan Library School. And there, to my horror, the dean told me that in order to get into the library school at Michigan, you had to know both French and German. Having only studied Spanish in college, I kind of dropped that idea for a while. Then for the next few years, I had various jobs, civil service and otherwise. Till 1949, I met my wife-to-be. And I finally decided it was time to find out what I wanted to do with my life. At that point, the idea of becoming a librarian came back to my mind. And also, I might mention that I had started law school at Wayne and had 1 year of law school in. And I would like to add that I had 3 A's and a B that year. I knew then I didn't want to really be a practicing lawyer, and the idea of becoming a law librarian came back to me. My wife lived in New York, had a good job there. I had the GI Bill, so I moved to New York, we got married, and I entered library school at Columbia. Fortunately, they took Spanish. And then, after I received my master's, I was looking for a job in the law library. And my first position was at the University of Chicago, where I was supposed to spend half time cataloging in the main library and cataloging in the law library. Well, after a year, it was quite clear that cataloging was not for me. And I quit that. And my next step was to look for another job. And I ended up at the University of Illinois in Urbana as assistant law librarian. Now, assistant law librarian today sounds like a big job. Back in those days, the library staff consisted of Mrs. Davies, the law librarian, myself, and her secretary. But it was a great job for me. I got a lot of good experience there. And after being there for about 2.5 years, Professor Miles Price at Columbia, law librarian at Columbia, invited me to come there as his assistant law librarian. Well, I grabbed that position because Miles Price had a national reputation, and I knew that many of his previous assistant law librarians had ended up at very good jobs. So I was at Columbia for 4 years, and then I got an offer to go to the University of Colorado. I was there for 4 years, and one day I got a letter from Professor Merriman, who was the law librarian here, but was giving it up to go into full-time teaching, asked me if I'd be interested in coming to Stanford. Well, I was happy at Colorado, but frankly, I was getting bored there. The faculty there was not the most research-minded faculty. So I came out for an interview and liked it here. My wife liked it, and I was offered the position. This was in 1963. Stanford Law School at that time was just beginning to grow and boom. During the years before the war and the immediate years after the war, the law school at Stanford had a reputation for being a good teaching school, which it probably was. But it was not what we think of today as a research law school. The library collection was pretty small. It turned out that if they did not have a course in the curriculum, there was no books in the library. Now, in about, 1962, Dean Spaeth, who was responsible for turning the law school around, pulled a real coup and stole 3 famous law professors from Columbia: Professor Gunther, Professor Myers, Professor Franklin. And then the following year, Professor Williams joined the faculty. And that started the change in the Stanford Law School. I came here, as I said, in 1963, and there was an acting dean here, John McDonough, who left shortly thereafter. But Bayless Manning became dean in 1964. Manning was professor of law at Yale before he came here. And when he came here, he was determined to build this into one of the great law schools. And he knew very well that he could not do that without having a library, and a good library. So it was a beautiful position for me. He gave me a lot of money. At one point, an alumnus lived in a small town in Utah, I believe, or Nevada, and had no connection with the law school at all, died and left $100,000 to Stanford. Well, the president of Stanford at that time turned that money over to Bayless Manning, who turned the money over to the law library. And it was that started building the library. You could do a lot with $100,000 in those days. I remember making a report that it would cost $10 a volume to start building the collection. I also found when I came here, of course, that having this Columbia bunch here, plus well-known professors like Professor Baxter, Professor Merriman, and others like that, there was a lot to do in the library. Professor Franklin, I remember well, decided to give a course in copyright. And I'm not exaggerating. We didn't have one book in copyright. Williams and Myers, who came from Columbia, were the country's foremost experts in oil and gas law. We had one broken down set of Summerson Oil and Gas, which was about 5 years out of date. So most of my first few years here was in developing the collection. It was fun to do, especially when you have some money to do it with.
What did the library look like?
Well, it did not look like this building, I'll tell you that. We were in the old building that is now the Political Science Department on Silver Street, if you know where that is. It's a kitty corner from the business school there. And it was really overcrowded. The library itself did not have any space. The technical service staff all met in a room about 1/2 this size. We at the business school, which was immediately adjacent to the law library of the law school, had moved into the new building. So we took over their old stacks. And at the same time, when I came here, I was told when I was here for an interview, as a matter of fact, that the law school had already made plans to move into the old business school. Well, when Bayless Manning came here, that was the first thing he did, was to say, no, that would not work, and we have to go for a new building. And it was really a very wise move, because if they had moved into the old business school, in 5 years they would have been out of space. Manning was determined to make this into a great law school, gave me support in the library, and went out and recruited a lot of the professors are still here today. Now, another thing about the old building was that we had a reading room there that it's hard to describe, but it was separated from the rest of the library. So when we locked up the main part of the library, the reading room was open. It stayed open 24 hours a day, and kind of have a reputation among undergraduates who would come by 3 o'clock in the morning and see the lights on in the reading room. About that time, let's see, in the late 60s, in the early 60s, the Vietnam War came along. And in the late 60s, and then particularly the years after Nixon invaded Cambodia, this campus exploded. I look back at it now, it's kind of hard to believe. But there were marches and riots, and the police were called in, and it was really quite a mess. Also, several of the students were arrested, and then there was a procedure for trying students, which had a faculty, a member of a faculty, and some students on the, sitting like a court. Professor Jack Friedenthal, who was on the faculty at our time, was chairman of this. And he insisted on holding the meeting, which were trying these students, in the big classroom in the law school. And we ran out, we kept the card catalog when I came here, was in the reading room. We ran out of space, and I had to move it out in the corridor adjacent to the courtroom in which he was holding this trial, and which was jam full of students. Now, about that time, I remember reading about the Yale Law Library were having trouble, and someone actually spilt glue in the card catalog. And I was scared stiff what was going to happen to our card catalog. I actually came here a couple nights and stood guard at the catalog there. Fortunately, nothing happened. It was about that time that Professor Gunther was working on a biography of John Marshall. And he came in to see me, and he said to do this, he really needed a first edition of the United States reports. Well, they were not easy to get. Someone told me, in fact, I talked with the Supreme Court librarian, who said that, well, every time there was a new Supreme Court justice appointed, she had to go out and buy a new set, and they all wanted the original edition. Anyway, I finally located one. But then the question came up where to put it. We didn't have much room there. Well, we did have a room about this size that where the faculty used to meet, and had bookcases like this, and I decided to keep it there. And also, there were 2 entrances like there is here in this room, and those doors could be locked, except for somehow or other they were never locked. And one night, a student was walking by, and he smelled smoke. He went in there, and someone had actually started fire to the Supreme Court reports. Fortunately, he started at the wrong end, or the right end for me. He started at the latest ones, which were still in print. And so about 10 volumes of those were destroyed, which could be replaced. If he had started at the other end, we never would be able to replace those volumes. Those years, late 60s and early 70s, was not too much fun around here with all the student activities. And there was one time when the president's office asked for volunteer faculty to spend overnight in some of the buildings here. And I foolishly volunteered for one night, and there was a student with me. Fortunately, he was an ex-Marine. And every time I'd hear a noise, or we'd hear a noise, he would dash off to look at it, and I'd dash off in the opposite direction. But nothing happened then. But those were interesting times. Unfortunately, they're over with. Well, Bayless Manning was not successful. He was successful in a lot of things, and if there's probably Dean Spaeth and Bayless Manning get full responsibility to Stanford Law School, which now rates up with Harvard and Yale. But one thing surprising to all of us, Bayless was not a good fundraiser. He could not raise the money for a new building. And around 1971 or 72, he left. And Tom Ehrlich, who was on the faculty, became dean. And within almost weeks after he was here, I started hearing stirrings, and he raised the money. Well, the plans had all been designed and approved. They were just laying on the shelf. And I was certainly glad to get out of the old building, and it was really an interesting experience working with architects on the new building. And to this day now, I do not have much respect for architects. It was quite a battle with them. And also, one of my great desires that I never had in my career as a law librarian was to be able to design a law library without having the faculty around. And there were a lot of new schools started in the 60s, and a lot of law librarians had that privilege. But no, of course, the dean appointed a faculty committee, and they were quite determined what they wanted. I've been asked frequently why this law library does not have a reading room. The reason is the faculty, most of them at the time, were graduates of Harvard and Yale, and had this concept of the huge reading rooms at Harvard or Yale. If any of you have been at Harvard and seen the old Langdale reading room, you know what they meant. It was a huge room. Well, I agree. We didn't need that. They, though, insisted that they didn't want a reading room here. And they were going to plan a school for 500 students, and we'll have 500 carols in there. Well, I couldn't fight that, so we went along with that. Well, then what happened, as I was sure it would happen, was when Ehrlich became dean and the plans were revived, the architects could not possibly fit 500 carols into the space that was, with the money they were given. And when the final plans came down, there were carols every place you could think of. What was the rare book room was where the computers were. Now, you're now making it into the, I guess, the offices for your staff was all full of carols. What is now the bibliographic room is all full of carols. I just thought we really couldn't live with that. Well, fortunately, of course, when this thing revived again, the old guard was not around. And I finally made a deal with one of the associate deans who wanted to get some space out of the library. I'd give up some space in the basement if he'd let me get rid of some carols. So what I decided on was to get enough carols for the second and third year and let the first-year students be on their own, although there was space for them. Anyway, that's the main reason why we don't have a reading room, although we were not in this building one year when Rosalie Long, my associate, and I decided that we had to do something. And on the second floor, in the back, as you know, there were tables there, and it worked as a small reading room. I still think it was a mistake not having a reading room. But I had so many fights in my hands with the faculty and the architects that you couldn't win them all.
One thing I noticed when I first came here was how much space the library had. It seems like that was planned pretty well, in the open areas with the windows along the room and the other areas. How did you negotiate with architects to get so much space?
Well, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. It was one of the great advantages of being a member of the faculty, where I never, just as an aside, when I came here in an interview, there was some questioning whether I insisted on a faculty member, being a full faculty member. Well, I was professor of law at Colorado, and I wasn't about to come here without it. And then they told me, well, Harvard and Yale, the law librarians there, do not have faculty rank, which it was true at the time. But I said, either if they wanted me, they have to give me faculty rank, which they did. And main reason, really, and seriously, not so much for the status of it, was the realization that unless I was on equal footing with them, I would never be able to do my job. So it was being as a member of the faculty, being a member of the faculty of the building committee, I was able to insist on getting the design that I wanted to a large extent. Now, I didn't win them all. The third floor does not go back like the second floor does to windows. I lost that fight, but I did after. They were not very happy about the architects, but that's how the skylights got into the third floor there. It was just a fight, and I'll say this much with the dean. He pretty much went along with my thoughts on that. And there were several things I wanted to get into the building, which I think was accomplished. One was space, one was light, one was good space for the staff. I think the technical services staff still probably has the best technical service area of any law school in the country. But I also wanted to build into the new building, which I think I did, several other features. One, I wanted what is now the open reserve room. At Columbia, when I was at Illinois, when I was at Colorado, when I visited other law libraries, it was all the same. You walked in, there's a circulation desk, and then behind it were stacks that had all of the books that the students wanted, the horn books, the textbooks, which they would check out over the desk and return. Well, I wanted to avoid that. If students wanted to look at Prosser and Torts or the restatements of Torts, to go into the open reserve room and wouldn't have to bother checking them in and out. And we'd only keep behind the loan desk the books that were on course reserve. Well, that's worked out, I think, fairly well. Another thing I wanted to build in, which I did, and I don't know if it's still being filed or not, I hope it is. It occurred to me in thinking of what to do, is that in most new law schools that I've been into, they would design their layout of the reading rooms in the stacks. So you would have the National Reporter System in one place, the state statutes in another place. 5 years goes by and they run out of space. So then they move all of the National Reporter System someplace else, and 10 years later, the original layout had no bearing to, the present layout had no bearing to the original layout. And so the idea was to have on the accessible floors, and may I digress for a moment to say, when I was designing all this, I had no idea what the final outlook of the building would be. It would be a 1 floor, 3 floors, or that. So, but in any case, I was determined that once we laid out where all the various types of material are, they will stay that way forever. And then when the stacks fill up where the Harvard Law Review is, you move the last 10 volumes down to the basement. So what I wanted was a large area where books that are used 80% of the time can be shelved and readily accessible, and then have a huge basement where you can have the less used books. And it's worked out, I think, fairly well that way. Now, the big thing that's changed since we designed the building, of course, is computers. So I did the thinking about this in the mid-'60s. And the computers were a dream in somebody's eyes in that time.
At that time, photocopiers were just coming out, weren't they? Or did you install the first photocopier?
Well, yes, and in fact, this goes my first year here in 1963. Xerox had just come out with the first dry copier. And I went down and saw the dean's secretary. In those days, the dean's office consisted of the dean and a secretary. And I said, Betty, I think we ought to have a Xerox copier in here. And she said, Mr. Jacobstein, we'd have to guarantee him 90 copies a month. And it just shows you how it takes time for technology to catch up. And of course, several years later, well, in the old building, we only had room for one. In fact, we had to keep it outside in the corridor. It was coin operated, and about once a month, someone would break in and steal the coins out of it. Even then, when we planned this building, I did not anticipate the demand that would be for photocopying. So if any of you ever wonder, when you go into the open reserve room, there's one little closet there, what that was doing there. Originally, that was to be for our photocopying machine. Of course, we weren't in the building more than 6 months, and we had to move them into where they are now. We have 3 or 4 or 5 of them. Also saw, besides the development of photocopying, the computer came along. Now, my associate, Rosalie Long, at the time, who helped me in planning the building, we knew the computer was coming. And this is late 60s already, and all that was available, these big IBM mainframes. So we didn't know what to do, but we talked with the architects, and we kind of had them lay outlets underneath the floor so they could hook in, but that never really worked out very well. But there was not much we could do about that. So when,
do you remember when Lexus and Westlaw first came into play?
yeah, it was about, you first start hearing about Lexus in the late 60s and early 70s. And then, I think it was around the late 70s. When did you come here, Paul?
82.
And we already had the...
That one big Lexus
yeah.
that you sat down and taught me how to use this.
Right. So it was about 1978, 79. And there was a big terminal. Every time you wanted to use it, you had to call up and put your phone in a cradle there. And Dave Bridgman still tells me about when he was here and how you had to copy it 1 page at a time. But like everything else, technology moved ahead in that. And I was kind of interested to see how things go in circles. Before Westlaw and Lexus came in, and after they only been here for a few years, all of a sudden the students discovered that they could print out all of their cases. Before that, you walked into the copying room, and all 6 of our photocopy machines were going full blast. And so the computer took a lot of the business off the photocopying machines. What's happening next, I don't know. What else interested you?
You work with the American Association of Law Libraries in your collaborations with Mr. Mirsky.
Well, the AALL, when I joined in 1950, had 540 members nationwide. And then it started to grow, and of course the big growth, the AALL, came with the growth of law firm libraries and librarians. When I came to Stanford in 1963, there were just 2 law firms that had law firm librarians. I became active in the association from the very beginning. I got in committees. One of my first committees I was on was a committee on cataloging. And I only did that to imagine. I never saw the face of my old head cataloger when she saw me on a committee on cataloging. And then in the late 60s, I guess, I was elected to the executive board for 3 years. And the association was growing. And I felt it was important to be active in the association. And I've told this story to most of my staff at one time or the other, that I think it's important to go to meetings. And I tell them the story about when I was in Illinois. I've been there about 6 months or so, and I come in for lunch, and I see a note in my desk that Dean Harno wanted to see me. I went in to see him, and he had on his desk the program for a forthcoming AALL meeting. And he said, and this is true, he said, Myron, I want you to go to that meeting, he says, but don't attend any meetings. He said, the purpose of going there is to stand in the corridor and talk and make contacts. It was good advice, and I must confess, over the years I followed it. If anything worthwhile was said at any of the meetings. It usually ended up being published anyway. Now, my staff did not always follow my advice. I would see them in meetings, but that's why I thought it was important, and I made an awful lot of contacts that way, which just helped me being a librarian. When one famous example of this, when I was at Colorado, a very, very wealthy alumnus was a lawyer in town. The dean had told me to treat him carefully. Came in to see me one day, and he said he had to find Bank of England's Exchange Regulation number 8. Now here I was out in the Colorado, with no big libraries nearby. But at one of the AAL conventions, I had met the librarian from the Advanced Institute of Legal Research in London. So I wrote him. And he wrote me back an apologetic letter that, well, it's kind of confidential. You really can't do anything about it. Then I said, oh, heck. I called up Phil Putnam then, who was a reference librarian at Harvard. And overnight mail, he sent me a copy of it. Ever since then, I've been impressed with the Harvard Law Library and impressed that there's nothing a library shouldn't have in its collection. Sooner or later, it's going to be used. I became president in 1977, I think it was. And the biggest thing that happened during that term was my fight with the H.W. Wilson Company, which, as you all know, is the publisher of the Reader's Digest and other publishers. And they, for years, were putting out the Index of Legal Periodicals. Well, this was owned by AALL. They had contracted the publication of it out to Wilson. And it was a terrible, terrible index. I don't know if any of you had occasion to use the index in early years. But there was not it wasn't an author subject. If you went to the index and looked under capital punishment, and then you had to go to the heading there and go through entries there to see if there was an article by Prosser or somebody. This wasn't a very good index. My immediate predecessor at the AALL, Al Coco, had appointed a committee to do something about the Index of Legal Periodicals. I wasn't on that committee. And the committee, in fact, Roy Mursky was on it, and a couple others, and they tell me the story that they were in the Bronx, where the H.W. Wilson Company is, and not a very nice part of the Bronx anymore. And they were not received very well. At 5 o'clock, they turned them out in the street there, and there was no taxis around or anything. So when I took over then, I appointed a committee to see maybe we could get another company to do the index. And we sent out proposals to about 6 different information companies and met, and they all came and presented.